This is Scott Allen Miller, and I'm here with an IT 101 educational segment with Mango Lassi and Mango Khan, and sponsored by the NTG Labs. Today's IT 101 is about IT implementation patterns. Now, what are implementation patterns? We actually get these from other industries. Implementation patterns originated in architecture and made their way into things like mechanical engineering, civil engineering, and areas like that. From there, they made their way into software engineering. From software engineering, we were introduced to them in IT. Today, those fields, not IT, but all the others, have very well established implementation patterns that they use throughout their industries. IT does not have this as strong, but they are being developed, and they're very important for us to understand what they are and where we will find them, and to think about things that we do and how they relate to them. Now, exactly what is an implementation pattern? In architecture, for example, this may be a certain type of layout for a room, a way that windows will face percentages of wall space that need to be certain types of light, or where a door has to be in a room, things like that. There's a lot of things that were developed over thousands of years of designing living spaces and working spaces that they learned made people happy or that were very efficient. In civil engineering, for example, we learn things like certain types of arches for bridges or certain road materials that are used over and over again. These become implementation patterns. They're not the same as something like a rule of thumb or a best practice, but they are means of solving problems that are repeatable, and we begin to learn them as larger sets, so we don't have to memorize or learn exactly how all of the pieces will go together in order to convey that information to someone else. In software engineering, the idea of patterns became very large in the late 1980s when the Gang of Four wrote their first book, developing a large set of standard implementation patterns that they had recognized over the past decades arising in the software engineering field. Software engineering very quickly began to look at patterns as ways to convey information to other software engineers very quickly. These implementation patterns would allow, well, for example, the singleton pattern. This singleton pattern would arise in code time after time, but being implemented new by each person every time. Once it was understood to be an implementation pattern that they could go after and document and discuss and name, they were able to write it up, come up with very, very well-known ways to implement that pattern, so someone doesn't have to come up with it on their own each time. They would document that, and then when working through someone else's code, that code could simply mention that it's using a singleton pattern, for example, and when someone else looked at the code, they would instantly know what that pattern was there to do. This makes it easier to understand other people's code. It makes it easier to write your own code, because you don't have to rethink about how those things will work each time. And it also gives us a powerful language for thinking about how the code works. Someone who is writing that code for the very first time or after 100 times may not have recognized it as a pattern on their own. And because they may not have recognized it as a pattern or don't have a word for it, they may not remember it in the way that is most efficient. They may not implement it the same way each time. They're more error prone and they're less efficient. When we move that concept into IT, we are now beginning to have the same standard implementation patterns arise over and over again in different parts of the industry, in different areas. So for example, one of the places that we talk about implementation patterns all the time is in systems architecture. This would be areas such as designing a new compute system for, say, a business of 1 to 1,000 people. We very often are going to need a certain set of standard things, including storage, compute, networking, redundancy, things of that nature. We attack the same problems over and over again, such as capacity, performance, reliability, and so forth. Given those factors, a number of standard implementation patterns have already arisen and are well identified. We begin to talk about some of them all the time. And some of them we also identify as what we call anti-patterns, or things that we want to identify and be able to talk about as things we normally want to avoid. So a standard implementation pattern might be something like a column design in systems design. Right, so columns are known to be relatively flexible with a good degree of reliability. but we have an anti-pattern that's actually very, very common to identify. And one of the ways that we're tackling this problem of having an unidentified, risky, and costly architecture is by naming it and allowing people to discuss it as a repeating pattern that we see happening over and over again with different companies, different people who may not have realized that they were going after a standard pattern, or in this case, anti-pattern. The most popular or commonly named anti-pattern is the inverted pyramid of doom, or iPod. This is a architectural pattern that puts the most risk at the bottom, the structural component, and puts the most cost where it does the least good and has very little mitigation of risk. So this pattern, we can know things about that pattern very quickly by learning how it works. We can learn what its behavior is like, where its risks tend to lie, why people tend to implement it, where it makes sense, because even anti-patterns sometimes have a place where they make sense, whereas the column we know other things about. We know its risk factors inherently, we know where you're going to want to address its risks, how it generally is going to have a different cost profile, and we can compare and think about these different patterns very, very quickly. And I'm hoping that in this series, when we move on from IT 101 and start looking at more specific areas, that we're actually going to look at some of these implementation patterns, name them, describe them, and talk about what their factors are. That's not our goal here today. Today we just want to discuss exactly what implementation patterns are. And we're going to find these in all areas of IT, and depending on what you are working in, whether you're working in desktop support or Windows administration or network engineering or database design, we're going to have standard patterns that we need to identify and work with. And by doing so, we're going to find it easier and easier to work with each other and to become better professionals at what we do. So as you begin to work more in your career, it is important that you begin to think about the things that you see and the things that people talk about, and if they are recognizable patterns that you see happening over and over again. And think to yourself, if this is happening, is this a pattern? Maybe it's one that is named that you can bring up in a discussion and someone may be able to identify for you, or it may be because this is a new thing in the IT field. We're not having that many discussions about standard patterns. It may be that you're in a position to identify those things and bring them up and help to identify a new pattern for the first time, provide a name for it and a description for it, and bring it to the attention of other professionals for peer review, because this is stuff that's very, very important, especially as we try as a field to move IT from the nascent one that really arose in about the 1990s. Yes, we had IT as a business infrastructure component prior to that, going back as far as the 1940s, but we didn't really begin to have it as a large-scale discipline until about the 1990s. So we're in a very young field, and things like implementation patterns are only beginning to arise later, closer into the mid-2000s. And now that we're in the mid-2010s, we're in a position where we're finally able to identify patterns that have stuck around and ones that we see happening more and more in the future. And we have a better understanding of what the risks and advantages of different patterns are. And some fields, like systems architecture, are getting those patterns identified much more early than some others are. Whereas things like Windows administration may be very patternless currently, simply because they've not been identified. The discussions don't happen as much in those groups. And others, like database design, they're happening more and more. And a lot of work went into pattern recognition, even without that name, in the 1970s into database design. A lot of that has carried through, and we see some of those patterns, but we don't necessarily think of them as patterns. Getting the idea of patterns into our minds allows us to do more and more with the way we think about the field. And it's a great way to grow your career and improve how you do what you do. So I'm Scott Alan Miller, and I want to thank you for joining me on this quick discussion on IT implementation patterns. I hope this has been useful to you. Leave comments, and remember that you can join us live at MangoCon, where we're going to be discussing things like this every year as we get together, and we try to help you grow as an IT professional.